For 6 years, Emma Maddox lived in absolute darkness. Her father, a Hells Angels president, spent everything trying to fix it. Dozens of doctors, thousands of dollars, zero results. Then, a homeless 10-year-old boy with no medical training walked up to her in a park, reached toward her eye, and did the impossible. In 30 seconds, she saw light for the first time in her life. But what that biker did for that homeless boy 60 seconds later, that's the part you never saw coming. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. Daddy. The word hung in the air like a question mark, shaped from hope alone. Emma Maddox's lips formed the sound carefully, deliberately, the way a sculptor might shape clay without ever seeing the final form. Her voice was soft, tentative, reaching out into a world she had never truly experienced. Bruce Maddox heard it, but Emma couldn't see his response. She couldn't see anything. Not the warm smile spreading across her father's weathered face as he turned toward her. Not the gentle movement of his leather jacket. Not the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Not even her own hands reaching out to find him. For 6 years, Emma had lived in absolute darkness, a darkness so complete, so total that every step she took was nothing more than an educated guess. She remembered where furniture was placed because she'd memorized it 1,000 times, navigating by touch and sound, trusting that nothing had moved. But she had never seen it, not once. Bruce stood there in the doorway of their small Reno home, watching his 6-year-old daughter try to navigate a world that existed only in darkness. His jaw tightened, not from anger, not from frustration, but from a pain so deep, so profound that it had carved permanent lines into his weathered face. This was a man who'd survived decades in the Hells Angels. A man who carried scars from fights, highways, and losses that would have broken most people. Bruce, Iron Hand, Maddox wasn't a man easily shaken. But watching his daughter live in darkness, that shook him every single day. Emma tilted her head slightly, the way she always did when trying to sense where things were. Her small fingers reached up, touching gently near her right eye, trying to ease some invisible pressure that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. She winced, just barely, but Bruce caught it. He caught everything. He'd spent thousands of dollars trying to fix this. Ophthalmologists, specialists, neurologists, pediatric eye surgeons with impressive credentials, and even more impressive bills. They'd all taken his money. They'd all run their tests. They'd all offered their theories. Optic nerve damage, some said. Congenital defect, others suggested. Developmental abnormality, retinal dysfunction. The medical jargon came fast and clinical, but the answers never did. Every appointment ended the same way with shrugs, apologies, and another referral to yet another specialist who couldn't help. Emma had learned to navigate by sound. She'd learned to feel textures and temperatures. She'd learned to exist in a world that moved and shifted and glowed around her while she remained locked in darkness. And she did it with more grace than most adults could manage. But Bruce saw the confusion on her face when other children described colors she couldn't comprehend. He saw the way she'd place her tiny hand on his face when he spoke, trying to understand expressions through touch since she couldn't see them. He saw her frustration when she tried to draw pictures like other kids, her hand moving across paper she couldn't see, creating shapes that existed only in her imagination. It wasn't fair. And Bruce Maddox, a man who'd made peace with most of life's injustices, couldn't make peace with this one. So, he did what he rarely allowed himself to do. He took a day off. He pushed aside the club business, the rides, the Brotherhood obligations that usually consumed his time. He dressed Emma in her favorite soft pink dress, the one that made her feel like a princess, packed a small bag with snacks and juice boxes, and decided to take her to the neighborhood park. Maybe the fresh air would help. Maybe the swings would bring her joy. Maybe for just one afternoon, he could give her a moment of happiness that didn't require sight. It was a small hope, a modest goal. But what Bruce didn't know What he couldn't possibly have known as he buckled Emma into his truck and headed toward that park was that the answer to 6 years of darkness was already there, waiting, sitting on a worn wooden bench just 20 feet from where they'd soon stand. And it wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a specialist with decades of training or access to expensive medical equipment. It was a 10-year-old homeless boy who'd learned to survive by noticing what everyone else missed. If you've ever watched someone you love struggle with something you can't fix, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next proves that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. And if you believe in miracles, stick with me. The first doctor's appointment happened when Emma was 8 months old. Bruce had noticed it early. The way she didn't track movement with her eyes, didn't reach for colorful toys placed in front of her, didn't respond to the visual world that surrounded her. The pediatrician was reassuring. "Give it time," she'd said. "Some babies develop more slowly than others." So Bruce gave it time. 6 months later, when Emma still hadn't responded to a single visual stimulus, he took her to a specialist, then another, then another. The waiting rooms all looked the same. Sterile, cold, filled with outdated magazines and the quiet desperation of parents seeking answers. Bruce sat in those chairs dozens of times, Emma on his lap, her small body nestled against his leather jacket, completely unaware of the conversations happening around her in examination rooms with bright lights she couldn't perceive. The tests were exhaustive. Visual acuity testing, electroretinography, visual evoked potential tests, OCT scans, and MRI imaging. Each one is more expensive than the last. Each one promising clarity that never came. "Mr. Maddox, the optic nerve appears structurally intact." "Mr. Maddox, there's no retinal damage we can identify." "Mr. Maddox, this is quite unusual. We're not seeing the typical markers of congenital blindness." The medical terminology became a language Bruce learned to hate. Words like idiopathic, unexplained etiology, and "we'll need to run more tests" became the soundtrack to his frustration. They weren't answers. They were expensive ways of saying, "we don't know." Bruce paid every bill without hesitation. Money wasn't the issue. He'd spend every dollar he had if it meant giving Emma her sight. But the problem was that no amount of money seemed to matter. One specialist suggested advanced corrective lenses. They fitted Emma with specialized glasses that magnified and enhanced light. She wore them for 3 months before the doctor admitted they weren't helping. Another recommended experimental gene therapy. Bruce researched it obsessively, stayed up nights reading medical journals and clinical trial results, and prepared himself for the procedure. But when they did the pre-treatment evaluation, the surgeon shook his head. "Her case doesn't fit the typical profile. I'm not confident the therapy would be effective." More money, more tests, more appointments that ended with sympathetic looks and no solutions. What made it worse? What made Bruce's jaw clench and his hands ball into fists during those appointments was that Emma clearly felt something. She'd touch near her right eye, always the right, and gently press with those tiny fingers. Sometimes she'd wince. Sometimes she'd rub at it absently like there was pressure building inside that she couldn't explain. Bruce mentioned it every single time. "Doctor, she keeps touching her right eye. Could there be something there? Some kind of obstruction?" They'd look. They'd shine their lights and examine her eye with instruments that cost more than most people's cars, using advanced imaging that could see every layer of tissue. "Everything appears clear, Mr. Maddox. The eye looks normal. There's no obstruction we can detect." But the discomfort remained, and Emma kept touching, kept pressing, kept trying to ease something that every trained medical professional assured Bruce didn't exist. By the time Emma turned 6, Bruce had seen 17 different specialists. He'd spent over $40,000 on appointments, tests, scans, and consultations. He'd traveled to San Francisco, Los Angeles, and even Seattle, chasing recommendations and second opinions from doctors who claimed to be the best in their field. Every single one of them looked at Emma's eye. Every single one of them missed what mattered. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that every specialist failed to see what a 10-year-old boy would spot in seconds. But we're getting ahead of ourselves because while Bruce was exhausting every medical option in Reno, spending his days in sterile waiting rooms and his nights researching miracle cures, another story was unfolding just 3 miles away. Meanwhile, 3 miles across Reno, another child was fighting a completely different battle, one of survival. Daniel didn't remember his mother's face anymore. Not clearly, anyway, just fragments. The warmth of her hand holding his, the sound of her humming songs he could no longer name, the way she'd stroke his hair when thunder scared him at night. What he did remember with painful clarity was the night the shelter caught fire. He was 7 years old. The smoke alarms screamed through the building, pulling families from their cots and mattresses, sending everyone scrambling toward the exits in panic. Daniel remembered his mother pushing him forward, her hands firm on his shoulders, guiding him through the chaos towards safety. He made it out. She didn't. They told him it was smoke inhalation. They told him she didn't suffer. They told him a lot of things that were supposed to make a 7-year-old feel better about losing the only person who'd ever loved him. None of it helped. His father lasted another 8 months. 8 months of showing up drunk, then not showing up at all. 8 months of broken promises and empty apologies until one morning, Daniel woke up in their motel room, and his father was just gone. No note, no explanation, no goodbye, just gone. Daniel was 8 years old, and he was completely alone. Most kids would have panicked, would have gone to authorities, to child services, to anyone who might help. But Daniel had learned early that the system didn't always work the way people claimed it did. He'd seen other kids disappear into foster care, bouncing from home to home, their eyes growing harder with each move. So Daniel made a different choice. He chose to survive on his own terms. He didn't beg. Something in him, pride maybe, or his mother's voice still echoing in his memory, refused to hold out his hand and ask for pity. He didn't steal either. His mother had taught him better than that. Instead, Daniel learned to help. He'd hover near diners during the morning rush, offering to bus tables or sweep floors in exchange for breakfast. He'd linger behind barber shops, helping elderly barbers carry out trash or sweep up hair clippings, earning a few dollars and sometimes a sandwich. He'd find food stalls at the edge of parking lots and volunteer to help vendors pack up at the end of the day, receiving whatever didn't sell. He lived in the corners of life, the spaces between buildings, the alleys behind restaurants, the park benches that nobody else wanted. He kept himself clean as best he could using gas station bathrooms. He wore the same faded cargo shorts and hand-me-down shirts until they were threadbare. And he learned to be invisible. When you're homeless and 10 years old, invisibility is survival. You don't draw attention. You don't make noise. You simply exist quietly, hoping nobody notices you long enough to ask questions you can't answer. But here's what happened. When Daniel became invisible to everyone else, he started seeing things other people missed. Daniel had a gift nobody knew about, a gift born from desperation. He could read pain in people's faces and bodies. He'd spent so long being invisible that he'd learned to see what others missed. The slight squint of an old woman with vision problems. The way a construction worker shielded his eyes from bright light. The exhaustion in a waitress's eyes after a double shift. Daniel saw suffering because he knew it intimately. 6 months earlier, behind a diner on 4th Street, he noticed an elderly man sitting on a milk crate, squinting and rubbing his eye in obvious discomfort. Daniel had approached carefully, the way he always did, and asked if the man was okay. "Something stuck in there," the old man had muttered. "Been driving me crazy for days. Can't see worth a damn." Daniel had looked carefully, and there, just visible on the surface of the eye, was a tiny foreign object, a sliver of something that had lodged itself under the eyelid and scratched across the cornea with every blink. Daniel had seen similar things before. His mother had once helped a neighbor with the same problem, using clean water and patience. He'd helped the old man that day, carefully, gently, and when the irritant finally came free, The relief on the man's face was immediate. "Kid," the man had said, blinking tears of relief. "You just gave me back my sight." Daniel never forgot that moment. If you can't stand how children like Daniel are forgotten by society, comment "Every child deserves a home" down below. Let's remind ourselves what matters. And that memory, that one random act of kindness behind a greasy diner, was about to save a little girl's world. The park on West 5th Street wasn't much. A few swings with rusted chains, a slide that had seen better decades, patchy grass that turned brown every summer and barely recovered by fall. But it was quiet. And on that particular Tuesday afternoon in late September, it was exactly what Bruce needed. He pulled his truck into the gravel lot, killed the engine, and looked over at Emma in the passenger seat. She was already unbuckling herself, her face turned toward the sound of children playing, excitement evident despite not being able to see what awaited her. Bruce managed a small smile. This was all he wanted, just one good day, one afternoon where his daughter could feel joy without the weight of her darkness pressing down on both of them. Emma moved toward the swings carefully, one hand extended slightly, feeling her way forward. Her pink dress caught the sunlight that she couldn't see, her small feet moving cautiously across unfamiliar ground. Bruce followed close behind, ready to guide her, his boots heavy on the ground, his mind still turning over the latest failed doctor's appointment from 3 days earlier. He was tired, not physically, but tired in the way that comes from years of trying and failing. Tired of hope that led nowhere. 20 feet away, sitting on a worn wooden bench near the basketball court, Daniel watched them arrive. He'd been there for about an hour, in his usual spot, when he needed a place to rest during the day. The park was safe. Families came and went. Nobody paid attention to a quiet kid on a bench. As long as he didn't cause trouble, didn't approach anyone, didn't draw attention, he could sit there for hours without anyone asking questions. Daniel had learned to occupy himself by observing. Watching people became both entertainment and education. He'd study how families interacted, how parents responded to their children, how people moved through the world with the casual confidence that came from having a home to return to. He noticed everything. So when Emma walked past him toward the swings, Daniel noticed immediately the way she moved. The cautious steps, the slightly extended hand feeling for obstacles. The unfocused gaze didn't quite track movement. The way her other hand drifted up to touch near her right eye, pressing gently, as if trying to relieve pressure. Daniel sat up straighter. Emma reached the swing with her father's help. He pushed her gently from behind. She smiled, tilting her head back toward the sunlight she couldn't see, but every few seconds, her hand would drift back to her right eye. The gentle pressure she applied with her fingertips, trying to ease something nobody else seemed to notice. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward on the bench, watching more carefully now. The angle of Emma's head, the way the afternoon sun illuminated her face, and that's when Daniel saw it. Just barely visible at the corner of her right eye, something that shouldn't be there. A tiny translucent mass, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for and caught it in just the right light. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He knew exactly what that was. A growth on the surface of the eye, probably there since birth, slowly expanding over the years. Not inside, where doctors would scan and image, but right there on the surface, so thin and clear it was nearly invisible. The kind of thing that would create constant pressure, block light from entering properly, and, if positioned just right over the pupil, cause complete vision loss. Daniel's heart started pounding. His hands gripped the edge of the wooden bench until his knuckles turned white. He could help her. He knew he could. It would take 30 seconds, maybe less. One careful removal, and that little girl could see for the first time in who knows how long. But Daniel also knew what would happen if he approached her. He'd spent 2 years learning to be invisible precisely because approaching people, especially children, when you looked like he did, was dangerous. The father was right there. A big man, intimidating, The kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to protect his daughter from a strange barefoot kid with scraped knees and unwashed clothes. If Daniel approached her, the man might grab him, might hurt him, might call the police, and then what? Foster care, questions he couldn't answer. The end of his freedom. But if he didn't approach her, that little girl would stay blind forever, when the solution was right there, when he could fix it in seconds. Daniel's heart started racing. He knew exactly what was wrong, but he also knew what would happen if he approached a biker's daughter uninvited. He had seconds to decide. Stay safe and invisible, or risk everything to help. Daniel's decision came in the space between heartbeats. One moment, he was frozen on that bench, paralyzed by fear and self-preservation. Next, his body was moving before his mind could talk him out of it. He jumped up, his bare feet hitting the dusty ground with purpose. Emma had stepped off the swing and was moving slowly toward the slide, her hands extended slightly, feeling her way. She was maybe 15 feet away from Daniel now, moving in that careful, cautious way. Daniel started walking toward her, his heart hammered so violently in his chest he thought it might crack his ribs. Every survival instinct he had honed over 2 years of living on the streets screamed at him to stop, to sit back down, to stay invisible, but he kept walking. Emma sensed someone approaching, the sound of footsteps on gravel. She turned her head toward the sound, her unfocused eyes not quite finding him, curious but not afraid. Bruce saw too. The reaction was immediate and primal. Bruce's body shifted between Daniel and Emma before conscious thought even registered. His hand came up, palm out, a barrier of flesh and authority. "Hey!" Bruce's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "Back up." Daniel stopped immediately, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm, but he didn't back away. His eyes were locked on Emma, specifically on her right eye, and the urgency in his face was unmistakable. "I'm sorry," Daniel said quickly, his voice higher than he wanted it to be, cracking slightly with nervousness. "I'm sorry, but please." "I said back up, kid." Bruce's tone left no room for negotiation. He was a full foot taller than Daniel, broader, harder, a man who'd spent decades making people listen when he spoke. But Daniel shook his head, the movement quick and desperate. "Please," he repeated, and this time, there was something in his voice that made Bruce hesitate. Not fear, not manipulation, just raw, genuine concern. "Something's on her eye. I can see it. I think I can help." Bruce's jaw tightened. This was Reno. Homeless kids approached people all the time with stories, with angles, with reasons why you should give them money or attention or trust. Bruce had heard them all. He developed a thick skin against sob stories and manipulation. But this kid wasn't asking for money, wasn't even looking at Bruce. His entire focus was on Emma, and the expression on his face was one Bruce recognized because he'd seen it in the mirror for 6 years. Desperation to help someone who was suffering. Bruce's hand shot out and grabbed Daniel's wrist. Not violently, but firmly. A warning and a restraint all at once. "You've got 5 seconds to explain yourself," Bruce said quietly. The kind of quiet that was more threatening than shouting. Daniel looked up at him, those sharp eyes. Eyes that had seen too much for a 10-year-old, meeting Bruce's without flinching. "There's something on her eye," Daniel said, speaking fast but clearly. "A growth on the surface, probably been there since birth. I can see it when the light hits right. It's covering her pupil. That's why she keeps touching it. That's why she can't see. I've helped with this kind of thing before. I know what to do. Please, just let me try. If you're holding your breath right now, you're not alone. Hit that like button if you want to see this boy prove everyone wrong." Bruce stared at him. His grip on Daniel's wrist didn't loosen, but something shifted in his expression. Doubt, maybe, or desperate hope wearing the disguise of skepticism. Emma stood there between them, unaware of the tension, her hand once again drifting to her eye. Bruce made his decision. He didn't release Daniel's wrist. Not yet, but he stepped aside just enough to give the boy a narrow path to his daughter. What happened in the next 10 seconds would either end in a homeless boy getting hurt or a miracle no one saw coming. Daniel moved slowly, deliberately, every motion telegraphed and careful, as if approaching a frightened animal. Emma sensed him getting closer, turned her face toward the sound of his movement, her head tilted in that familiar way, completely unaware that the next 30 seconds would change her entire world. "I need to look at her eye," Daniel said softly, more to Bruce than to Emma. "I won't hurt her. I promise." Bruce's grip on Daniel's wrist tightened for just a moment. A final warning, a final hesitation, and then loosened slightly. Not a release, just enough slack for Daniel to move. Daniel knelt down, bringing himself to Emma's eye level. He smiled at her, even though he knew she couldn't see it. Emma smiled back, innocent and trusting in the way only children can be, responding to the gentle tone of his presence. "Hi," Daniel whispered. "This might feel weird for a second, but I'm going to help you, okay?" Emma's unfocused eyes searched in his direction, trying to make sense of the voice. Daniel leaned in closer. His right hand came up, fingers extended, approaching Emma's right eye with the kind of precision that seemed impossible for a 10-year-old boy. But Daniel had learned precision from necessity. When you survive by helping others, you learn to be gentle, to be careful, to not harm. Bruce stood over them both, his body coiled tight as a spring, his hand still wrapped around Daniel's wrist. One wrong move, one indication that this kid meant harm, one cry from Emma, and Bruce would pull him away so fast the boy's feet would leave the ground. But Daniel's fingers were steady. He tilted Emma's head just slightly, angling it to catch the afternoon sunlight. And there it was, the translucent growth visible now that he was close enough, and the light hit it perfectly. A thin membrane covering the center of her eye, so clear it was almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Daniel's index finger and thumb moved into position. Slow, careful. His touch was feather-light as he made contact with the edge of the growth. Emma's eyes widened slightly at the sensation, foreign, strange, but not painful. Bruce's breathing stopped entirely. His grip tightened again on Daniel's wrist, knuckles white, ready to yank the boy back at the first sign of distress from his daughter. Daniel began to lift. Not roughly, not quickly, just steady, gentle pressure, peeling the membrane free from where it had been attached for who knows how long. Seconds stretched into eternity. The growth resisted at first, held in place by years of natural adhesion. Daniel adjusted his angle slightly, his young face a mask of concentration, his bottom lip caught between his teeth. And then it moved. The thin, translucent membrane began to lift free, millimeter by millimeter, carefully drawn away by Daniel's precise touch. It was larger than Bruce expected, nearly covering Emma's entire pupil, a gossamer film that had blocked light from entering her eye properly. Daniel held it in his fingers for just a moment. Proof, evidence, the answer to 6 years of medical failures. And then he let it fall away. Silence. A beat of absolute nothing. Emma stood completely still, her eyes unfocused, her expression frozen somewhere between confusion and shock. Something had changed. Something fundamental, something she couldn't yet name. And then light flooded in. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once. 6 years of accumulated visual information hit her brain simultaneously. Colors, shapes, movement, depth, brightness, everything. Her breath hitched. A sharp, sudden intake of air that had nothing to do with breathing and everything to do with overwhelming sensation. Her eyes widened, pupils contracting against the sudden influx of light, her entire body going rigid. The world exploded into existence. The blue sky above, the green trees swaying in the breeze, the other children on the playground in their bright clothes, the ground beneath her feet, her own hands in front of her face. Her father's face, this face she'd only known through touch, was now visible for the first time. And colors. Oh God, colors. Emma's hands flew to her face, both of them. as if trying to confirm that the sensation was real. Her lips trembled. Her chin quivered. Tears spilt down her cheeks, hot and fast and unstoppable. She looked up at her father, this man she'd known her entire life but had never truly seen. And her voice came out cracked and broken and more beautiful than any sound Bruce had ever heard in his life. "Daddy," she whispered, the words shaped by memory but spoken with sight for the very first time. "I can see you." Bruce, Iron Hand, Maddox had been in bar fights that left men unconscious. He'd ridden through thunderstorms that turned highways into rivers. He'd buried brothers who died too young and stood at gravesides without shedding a tear, because that's what being strong meant in his world. But seeing his daughter's eyes finally focus on his face for the first time in her life, that broke him completely. His knees went weak. Actually weak. The toughest man in Nevada felt his legs tremble beneath him, felt the ground shift like he'd been hit with something he couldn't fight back against. He released Daniel's wrist, forgot he was even holding it, and dropped into a crouch in front of Emma. His hands reached for her face, needing to see her eyes, needing to confirm this was real. Emma's hands were still touching her face, fingers trembling, her entire body vibrating with the overwhelming sensation of a world that had suddenly become visible. "Daddy," she said again, and this time she saw his face when she said it, saw his expression, the tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. You're crying. I can see you crying. I can see," she whispered, testing the words, watching her father's face react to them. "Daddy, I can see. I can see you. I can see everything." Her voice rose with each word, climbing from whisper to speaking volume, as if she needed to confirm the magnitude of what was happening. And Bruce, this hardened man who'd spent decades building walls around his emotions, felt every single one of those walls crumble into dust. Tears poured down his face. Not quiet tears, not dignified ones, but the kind that come from somewhere deep in the chest, from a place that holds 6 years of helplessness and frustration, and watching your child struggle with something you couldn't fix, no matter how hard you tried. He pulled Emma into his arms and held her so tight it probably hurt. But she didn't complain. She pulled back just enough to look at his face, to study every line, every scar, every detail she'd only imagined before. "The sky is blue," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Daddy, the sky is so blue. And the trees are green. And your eyes are brown. Everything is so much." Bruce couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely. All he could do was nod and hold her and cry in a way he hadn't cried since he was a child himself. And then he remembered Daniel. Bruce looked up, his vision blurred with tears, and found the boy standing a few feet away. Daniel had backed up after the removal, giving them space, his bare feet shifting nervously on the dusty ground. His face carried an expression Bruce had seen before on the faces of combat veterans. The look of someone who'd just done something impossible and couldn't quite process it themselves. 6 years, thousands of dollars, dozens of specialists with impressive degrees and expensive equipment and access to the latest medical technology. And a barefoot 10-year-old boy did what none of them could. Bruce stood slowly, still holding Emma against his chest with one arm. He looked at Daniel, really looked at him, seeing not just a homeless kid, but someone who'd just fundamentally altered the course of his daughter's entire life. When Bruce finally spoke, his voice shook in a way none of his bikers had ever heard. Not from anger, not from intimidation, but from gratitude so profound it changed the texture of every word. "Kid," Bruce breathed, barely getting the word out. "You changed my little girl's life." Daniel shrugged slightly, almost apologetically, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I just wanted to help," he said quietly. "If you believe this boy deserves everything after what he just did, comment Daniel is a hero. If you think kids like him should never be homeless, share this story. Make some noise for the invisible children." Bruce wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing tears across weathered skin. And in that moment, looking at this skinny, barefoot boy who'd given him a miracle, Bruce made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. Bruce didn't think. There was no internal debate, no weighing of options or consideration of consequences. Some decisions bypass the mind entirely and come straight from somewhere deeper. From the gut, from the heart, from whatever part of a person recognizes truth when it stands in front of them. This was one of those decisions. Bruce looked at Daniel, this child who'd spent 2 years surviving alone, who'd approached a stranger's daughter despite every instinct telling him to stay invisible, who'd risked everything to help someone he didn't know, and saw something he recognized. He saw someone worth protecting. Bruce's hands moved to his shoulders, fingers finding the worn leather of his Hell's Angels vest. The cut, as they called it, was the sacred garment that represented everything he was, everything he had earned over decades of loyalty and brotherhood. It was warm from the Nevada sun, heavy with the weight of patches and pins and memories stitched into every inch of leather. He lifted it off. The movement was slow, deliberate, ceremonial, like removing a crown to place it on another's head. Daniel watched with wide eyes, not understanding what was happening, his body tensing as if preparing to run. Bruce stepped forward, closing the distance between them in 2 strides. And then he draped the vest over Daniel's small shoulders. The leather swallowed the boy. It hung past his waist, the armholes gaping, the bottom hem nearly reaching his knees. Daniel stood there frozen, his thin frame barely filling a quarter of the space that Bruce's broad shoulders had occupied moments before. But the weight of it, the actual physical weight of leather and history and belonging, settled onto Daniel's shoulders like an anchor, like something solid in a world that had been weightless and uncertain for too long. "You're not alone anymore," Bruce said, his voice rough but steady now. Each word is carefully placed like stones building a foundation. "You stay with us now." Daniel's lips parted, but no sound came out. His eyes went glassy with tears he was trying desperately not to shed. His hands came up slowly, fingers touching the leather as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. I can't." Daniel's voice cracked completely. "I'm nobody. I'm just." "You're my daughter's miracle," Bruce interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "That makes you family. And family doesn't sleep on park benches. Family doesn't go hungry. Family doesn't survive. Family lives. You understand me?" Daniel nodded, though his face suggested he didn't quite believe what was happening. Kids who'd been abandoned learned not to trust good things, learned that kindness usually came with conditions, with expectations, with expiration dates. But there was something in Bruce's eyes, something unshakable and absolute that cut through Daniel's defenses like a blade through paper. Emma pulled away from her father just enough to look at Daniel. Her eyes, those eyes that could finally see, wet with tears but lit up with joy that made her look like she was glowing from the inside. "You're staying?" she asked, her voice full of wonder and hope, seeing his face clearly for the first time. Daniel looked down at her, then back at Bruce, then down at the vest drowning his small frame. "I'm staying," he whispered, and saying it out loud made it feel real in a way nothing had felt real in 2 years. Bruce placed his hand on top of Daniel's head, the gesture somewhere between a blessing and a claim. This boy was his now, his responsibility, his family. "We'll get you cleaned up," Bruce said, his mind already moving through logistics, through what Daniel would need. Food, clothes, a bed, school enrollment, medical care, everything a child should have had all along. "Get you fed, get you home." Home. Daniel had forgotten what that word meant. But Bruce wasn't the only one who'd have a say in Daniel's future. When the rest of the Brotherhood heard what happened, something unprecedented occurred. Word traveled fast in the Hells Angels. Bruce made one phone call from the park, just one, to his vice president, a man named Dutch, who'd ridden beside him for 15 years. Bruce's voice was still shaking when he explained what had happened, what Daniel had done, what he'd decided. "Bring everyone to the clubhouse," Bruce said. "I need the brothers to meet someone." Within an hour, motorcycles began rolling into the parking lot of the Hells Angels clubhouse on the east side of Reno. The rumble of engines announced each arrival, deep, throaty roars that vibrated through the walls and rattled the windows. One bike, then three, then seven, then a dozen. Men climbed off their machines, pulling helmets free, their leather cuts bearing the same red and white patches that Bruce wore. These were men society had labeled as dangerous, as outlaws, as people to be feared and avoided. And they were all gathering to meet a 10-year-old homeless boy. Daniel stood in the corner of the clubhouse common room, still wearing Bruce's oversized vest, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. Emma sat beside him on a worn couch, her hand clasped in his, refusing to let go. She kept looking around, discovering new things with her eyes. The texture of the walls, the faces of people, the way light moved through windows. The bikers filed in, their boots heavy on concrete floors. Massive men with scarred knuckles and weathered faces. Men who'd seen violence and survived it. Men who trusted no one outside their brotherhood. They looked at Daniel with expressions that made the boy's stomach clench with fear. But then Bruce told them the story. He stood in the center of the room, Emma on his hip now, and explained everything. The 6 years of darkness, the failed doctors, the park, Daniel's observation, the removal, Emma's first moment of sight. This kid, Bruce said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, gave my daughter something I couldn't buy, something specialists with fancy degrees couldn't provide. He gave her the world. The room fell silent. One of the older bikers, a man called Hammer, whose real name nobody remembered anymore, stepped forward. His face was a road map of scars and sun damage, his eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. He looked Daniel up and down, taking in the bare feet, the dirty clothes, the fear barely hidden behind defensive eyes. "How old are you, kid?" Hammer asked, his voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes and shouting over engine noise. 10, Daniel answered quietly, his voice almost disappearing into the ambient sounds of the room. Hammer nodded slowly. Then he looked at Bruce. "He got people, family somewhere?" "No," Bruce said simply. "He's been surviving on his own for 2 years." Something shifted in the room. The atmosphere changed in an almost tangible way. These men who rarely trusted outsiders, who'd been rejected by society themselves, who'd built their own family precisely because the world had pushed them out, didn't see Daniel as charity. They saw themselves in him. Every single one of them had a story, an absent father, an abusive home, a system that failed them, a world that decided they were worthless before they were old enough to prove otherwise. They'd all been Daniel at some point, alone, struggling, surviving on instinct and desperation. Dutch, the vice president, spoke next. He was younger than Bruce, but carried the same authority, the same presence that came from earning respect rather than demanding it. "President's making him family," Dutch said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Anyone got a problem with that?" Silence. Then Hammer stepped forward again, this time approaching Daniel directly. The boy tensed, every muscle in his body preparing to run, even though he had nowhere to go. Hammer extended his hand. "Welcome home, kid," he said simply. Daniel stared at the offered hand for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was real or some elaborate setup for disappointment. Then slowly, he reached out and shook it. His small hand disappeared completely inside Hammer's calloused grip. One by one, the other bikers stepped forward. Each one shook Daniel's hand. Each one welcomed him, not with pity, not with condescension, but with the same respect they'd show any prospect joining their ranks. "We'll set him up in the back room," someone said. "Kid needs clothes," another added. "I've got nephews about his size. I'll bring some things tomorrow." "School," a third voice chimed in. "He'll need to get enrolled. My old lady works at the district office. She can help with that." The logistics came fast, each brother offering something practical, something concrete. This wasn't empty charity. This wasn't a feel-good gesture that would fade when the emotion wore off. This was a brotherhood absorbing a new member, making space in their lives for someone who needed them. Bruce watched it happen with something close to awe. He'd expected support. His brothers always had his back. But this was different. This was unanimous, instant, and absolute. Daniel wasn't being tolerated. He was being claimed. By the end of the evening, Daniel had a room at the clubhouse. Not a cot in a corner, but an actual room with a door that locked from the inside and a bed with clean sheets. He had a drawer full of clothes that would arrive the next day. He had a list of brothers who'd volunteered to help him with homework, teach him to ride safely when he was old enough, show him how to fix engines and change oil, and survive with dignity. He had protection. He had structure. He had family. But the most beautiful part? It wasn't even over yet because Emma had one more gift to give Daniel. And it happened every single night. Daniel's first night in the clubhouse, he didn't sleep. He lay in that bed with clean sheets and a pillow that didn't smell like mildew or exhaust fumes, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for someone to burst through the door and tell him it was all a mistake, that he didn't belong, that he needed to leave. But morning came, and no one told him to go. Bruce knocked on his door at 7 o'clock, carrying a plate of eggs and toast that one of the brothers had cooked in the clubhouse kitchen. Daniel ate slowly, still not quite trusting that the food wouldn't be taken away, that this wasn't temporary. "You'll need boots," Bruce said, watching Daniel eat. "Can't have you walking around barefoot anymore. We'll get you sorted today." And that's exactly what happened. By noon, Daniel had boots, real ones, with thick soles and laces that actually stayed tied. He had jeans that fit, t-shirts that didn't have holes, and a jacket for when the Nevada nights got cold. He stood in front of a mirror in the clubhouse bathroom and barely recognized himself. He looked like a kid who belonged somewhere. The transformation wasn't just external. Over the following weeks, the Brotherhood absorbed Daniel into their daily rhythm. Hammer taught him how engines worked, the difference between two-stroke and four-stroke, how to diagnose problems by sound alone, how to rebuild a carburetor with patience and precision. Daniel learned fast, his hands steady and careful. That same competence he'd shown helping strangers now channeled into something constructive. Dutch took him to the motorcycle safety course, explaining road rules and defensive driving, even though Daniel was years away from being able to ride legally. "Knowledge first," Dutch said. "Speed later. You stay alive by being smart, not reckless." Another brother, a quiet man named Rev, who rarely spoke but listened to everything, taught Daniel about honor, about keeping your word, about the difference between surviving and living with dignity. "You never begged," Rev said one afternoon while they were cleaning bikes in the clubhouse garage. "You never stole. You survived by helping people. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." Daniel looked up from the chrome he was polishing, surprised. "You noticed that?" "Bruce told us," Rev said simply. "And yeah, we noticed. That's why you're here, kid. Not because we felt sorry for you, but because you've got character. You've got integrity. Those things matter more than blood." Remember, Daniel never begged, never stole. He survived by helping. And now, for the first time, people were helping him back. The change in Daniel was visible. Not overnight. Healing never happens overnight, but gradually, like spring thaw revealing ground that had been frozen for too long. His shoulders straightened. His eyes lost that constant wariness, that perpetual scanning for threats. He smiled more, laughed even, when one of the brothers told a terrible joke or when Emma insisted on showing him another thing she'd discovered with her news site. Bruce enrolled him in school, the local elementary, 5th grade. Daniel had missed significant chunks of education during his 2 years on the streets, but he caught up fast. Turned out a kid who'd learned to survive by reading people and situations was also pretty good at reading books. His teachers noticed something unusual about him, a maturity beyond his years, a kindness toward other kids who seemed lost or alone. During lunch, Daniel would seek out the children sitting by themselves and ask if he could join them. He recognized isolation because he'd lived it. If this is making you emotional, you're human. Subscribe if you believe every child deserves this kind of second chance. Comment, family isn't blood, if you agree that love is a choice. By the time October rolled into November, Daniel had been with the Brotherhood for 6 weeks. He had routine, stability. He woke up in the same bed every morning, ate meals at regular times, did homework at the clubhouse dining table while bikers drank coffee and argued about carburetors and politics. He had a life, but there was one part of his new reality that meant more to him than all the rest combined. One ritual that happened every single evening without fail involved the little girl who'd been the catalyst for everything. Every evening at 7:30, without fail, Emma would appear at Daniel's door. She'd knock, 3 soft taps, and wait for him to answer. When he opened the door, she'd be standing there in her pajamas, her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Is it time?" she'd ask, even though she already knew the answer. "It's time," Daniel would reply, smiling. And then Emma would take his hand and lead him to the clubhouse common room, to the old couch near the window, and they'd sit together in the gathering darkness while she discovered the world. It had started accidentally that first week after the park. Emma had been overwhelmed by sight. Every color was new. Every shape is unfamiliar and sometimes confusing. Bright lights made her squint and turn away. The sheer complexity of visual existence was too much all at once. But Daniel understood overwhelm. He'd lived it in a different way. So he'd sat with her one evening and started naming things, identifying objects, giving her context for the visual chaos flooding her senses. "That's the refrigerator," he'd said, pointing toward the kitchen. "It's white and tall. That's the color white." Emma had stared, her eyes focusing and refocusing, trying to understand what white meant. "And that?" she'd asked, pointing toward the window. "That's the sunset," Daniel had answered. "The sky turns orange and pink and purple when the sun goes down. Those are colors. They're beautiful." Her face had lit up with wonder. And so it became their ritual. Every night, Emma would sit beside Daniel, her tiny fingers tugging at his sleeve whenever she saw something new, something she couldn't identify, something that needed explanation. "Daniel, what's that?" became the question that shaped their evenings together. Daniel was endlessly patient. He never seemed annoyed by her constant questions, her need to categorize and understand every visual detail of the world around her. He'd lean close, look carefully, and then explain. "That's someone's shadow on the wall. See, when light hits you, it creates a dark shape behind you. That's a photograph. It's like freezing a moment in time so you can look at it forever. Those are stars, tiny lights in the sky, so far away they look small. There are millions of them. That's your own reflection in the window, Emma. That's what you look like." That last one had made her gasp with delight, seeing her own face clearly for the first time. The reversal wasn't lost on Bruce, who often watched them from across the room. The boy who'd once been invisible, who'd survived in corners and alleys with no one to talk to, was now teaching, guiding, becoming someone's bridge to understanding. And the girl who'd lived in darkness, who'd navigated the world through touch and sound alone, was now asking questions, engaging, discovering that sight gave dimension to everything she'd only imagined before. They needed each other in ways that went beyond gratitude or obligation. Daniel gave Emma context. Emma gave Daniel purpose. Together, they were healing wounds neither of them had words for. One evening, about a month after moving in, Emma discovered colors in a new way. She'd been staring at a painting on the clubhouse wall, trying to understand why certain colors made her feel certain things, when she suddenly stopped and looked at Daniel with wide eyes. "Colors have feelings," she said, as if the realization had just struck her. "They do," Daniel confirmed, smiling. "Red can feel angry or excited. Blue can feel calm or sad. Yellow feels happy." "What color am I?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "You're all of them," he said finally. You're every color at once. She beamed, and the joy on her face was brighter than any color in existence. The other bikers would sometimes pause their card games or their conversations to watch these two children, one teaching, one learning, and shake their heads in amazement at what had brought them all together. But there was one moment Emma wanted to share more than any other. And when it finally happened, it broke everyone who witnessed it. 6 months changed everything. It was March when the Brotherhood gathered for what had become their monthly family dinner. A tradition that predated Daniel's arrival but had taken on new meaning since he joined them. The clubhouse dining area was packed. Long tables pushed together, mismatched chairs filled with bikers and their families. The air was thick with the smell of grilled meat and laughter and belonging. Daniel sat in the middle of it all, surrounded by men who'd become his uncles, his teachers, his protectors. He wore a new vest now, not Bruce's oversized cut, but one made specifically for him. Leather still stiff and unmarked by road miles, but bearing a small patch that read "Little Brother" across the back. Emma sat beside him as she always did, looking around excitedly at everything, her eyes taking in every detail, every face, every movement. Her vision had grown stronger over the months, more confident. She could track fast movement now, recognize faces from across rooms, and she never stopped marveling at the gift of sight. Bruce watched them from across the room, a beer in his hand, a smile on his face that his brothers claimed had become permanent. Dutch stood beside him, following his gaze. "You did good, Prez," Dutch said quietly. Bruce shook his head. "Daniel did good. I just recognized it." The dinner continued. Food passed, stories shared, the kind of easy chaos that comes when family gathers without pretense or formality. Daniel was laughing at something Hammer had said. His face lit up in a way that erased every trace of the scared, barefoot boy from the park. And then Emma stood up on her chair. The movement caught everyone's attention. Conversations paused, heads turned. Emma was small for 6 years old, but standing on that chair, she commanded the room with the unself-conscious authority only children possess. She looked directly at Daniel, her eyes, those eyes that could finally see, locked on his face. She cupped her hands around her mouth, took a deep breath, and shouted at the top of her lungs, "I love you, Daniel." Her voice carried through the entire clubhouse, clear and strong, and filled with every ounce of affection a child's heart could hold. And this time, unlike every other time she tried to express love in her life, she could see his face when she said it, could see his expression change, could see the tears spring to his eyes, could see exactly what those words meant to him. The room went completely silent. Daniel's face crumpled, just completely fell apart. Tears streamed down his cheeks before he could even try to stop them, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotion he'd been holding back for months, maybe years, maybe his entire life. Because Daniel had never heard those words before. Not once. Not from his mother before she died. Not from his father before he left. Not from anyone in the 2 years he'd spent invisible and alone. He'd survived by being unwanted, by being forgettable, by accepting that love was something other people had, not something meant for him. But Emma, this little girl whose world he'd opened with one careful touch, was shouting her love for him loud enough for everyone to hear. And she meant it, and she could see him receive it. Daniel couldn't speak, could barely breathe. He just sat there crying while Emma climbed down from her chair and threw her arms around his neck, holding him with the fierce protectiveness of a little sister who'd claimed him as her own. Bruce moved then, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. Heavy, warm, unmistakable in its meaning. "You're my son now," Bruce said, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you are my children." Daniel looked up at him, tears still streaming, and nodded because words were impossible. "If you're crying, hit that like button. You're not alone. If you believe love like this should be shared, send this to someone who needs to remember that miracles are real." And if you want more stories that restore your faith in humanity, subscribe because I've got plenty more. The boy who lived in corners was now at the center of everything. The girl who lived in darkness now saw every beautiful thing the world had to offer. And the family that had formed in a park on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon was now unbreakable. 3 years have passed since that afternoon in the park. Daniel is 13 now. He's taller, his voice deeper, his bare feet long since replaced by boots he wears with the same pride he wears his vest. He's in 8th grade at Reno Middle School. And if you ask his teachers about him, they'll tell you he's one of the best students they've ever had. Not because he's naturally gifted, though he's certainly bright, but because he works harder than anyone else. Because he understands that education is a privilege, not a burden. Because he remembers what it felt like to have nothing, and he's determined never to waste the second chance he's been given. He's at the top of his class, on the honor roll every semester. But more than that, he's become the kid who notices others, who finds the students eating lunch alone and sits with them, who helps struggling classmates with homework, who sees the invisible children because he used to be one. His teachers call him an old soul. His classmates call him a friend. The Brotherhood calls him family. Emma is 9 now, thriving in ways that seemed impossible just 3 years ago. Her vision remains fully functional. No complications, no regression. She's in art classes now, not because she needs them, but because she wants them. Determined to capture the visual world she'd missed, to create beauty with her own hands, to understand color and light and perspective. She's learning photography, joined the school art club, and spends her afternoons discovering visual expression the way other children discover sports or music. Sight, which was once absent from her world, has become her passion. And every single night, she still sits with Daniel. Not to ask, "What's that?" anymore. She knows most things now, but simply to be near the person who gave her everything. But the story didn't end with Daniel and Emma. 6 months after Daniel moved into the clubhouse, Bruce called a formal meeting of the Reno chapter. All members present. He stood before them with a proposal that would change the direction of their brotherhood. "We've got space here," Bruce had said. "We've got resources. We've got brothers who know what it's like to be forgotten. So here's what I'm proposing. We start a program for homeless kids. Kids like Daniel who are surviving alone because the system failed them." The vote was unanimous. They called it Daniel's Law. Not a legal statute, but a code within their chapter. A commitment that any child in genuine need, any kid surviving on the streets without family or support, would have a place with them. Not as charity cases, not as projects, but as family. Within a year, 3 more children had found homes within the Brotherhood. A 15-year-old girl who'd been couch surfing after aging out of foster care. Twin boys whose mother had died and whose father was serving time. A 14-year-old who'd run from an abusive household and refused to go back. Each one was vetted carefully. Each one was given structure, protection, education, and belonging. Each one was taught the same lessons Daniel had learned. That family isn't about blood, it's about choice. That survival isn't enough. You have to live with dignity. That being helped doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. The Reno chapter's initiative made local news, then regional news. And that's when something unexpected happened. 3 other motorcycle clubs across Nevada, chapters that had no formal affiliation with the Hells Angels, clubs that operated independently with their own traditions and territories, reached out to Bruce. They'd seen the coverage, read the stories, and they wanted to do the same thing. And here's what nobody expected. Daniel's story inspired 3 other motorcycle clubs in Nevada to do the same thing. Dozens of homeless children now have families because one boy was brave enough to help a little girl in a park. The Vagos in Las Vegas, the Mongols in Carson City, and an independent club called the Desert Riders in Elko. All of them started their own versions of the program. All of them opened their clubhouses and their lives to children who needed them. Within 3 years, 47 children across Nevada had found families through motorcycle clubs. 47 kids who'd been invisible, forgotten, or abandoned now had homes, structure, protection, and love. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. These clubs, organizations that society often painted as dangerous, as criminal, as threats to be feared, were doing more for vulnerable children than most government programs. They weren't doing it for recognition or tax breaks or positive publicity. They were doing it because they understood what it meant to be cast out, to be judged, to be told you don't matter. Bruce was asked about it once during a local news interview that Daniel and Emma watched from the clubhouse couch. "Mr. Maddox, why do you think your organization has been so successful with these children when traditional systems struggle?" Bruce had thought about it for a moment, then answered simply, "Because we don't see them as problems to be solved. We see them as people who deserve a family. And maybe that's all any kid really needs, someone who sees them." But later that night, after the cameras left and the clubhouse settled into its evening rhythm, Bruce said something different, something quieter, something truer. Daniel was doing homework at the dining table. Emma was sketching in the corner, her colored pencils spread across the floor. The Brotherhood was scattered throughout the building, living their lives in the comfortable chaos of family. Bruce stood in the doorway, watching all of it, and Dutch heard him whisper, "I thought I was saving him. Turns out he saved all of us." This story proves that the smallest act of kindness can change everything. If you believe people like Daniel and Emma deserve to be celebrated, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I hunt down these stories to remind you that humanity is still good. Comment, "Thank you, Daniel," down below if this story moved you. And if you know someone who's struggling, who feels invisible, share this video with them. Let them know they matter. Let them know their story isn't over. Because sometimes miracles don't just happen to one person. Sometimes they ripple outward, touching lives we'll never even know about. And it all started with a barefoot boy, a blind little girl, and 30 seconds in a park that changed everything.